Oregon has nearly $12 million invested in Fox Corporation stock. Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum and the state treasurer Tobias Reed want to know if the company's board hurt Oregon's investment by allowing its news show to make those false claims about Dominion voting systems. Dominion sued Fox for $1.6 billion after its hosts repeated the false claims made by then-President Trump and his allies about the stolen election. Some hosts on Fox continued to promote the election lies to their audiences, even though they privately ridiculed them.
After allegations that their machines caused thousands of votes in one Michigan county to be switched from Donald Trump to Joe Biden.
Court filings showed the internal conversations, texts, and testimony showed that some of Fox's biggest names knew those claims were false.
We have evidence of how they flipped the votes, how it was designed to flip the votes.
The cable network's biggest star, Tucker Carlson, wrote to his producer about that Trump lawyer days after the election. Sidney Powell is lying, he wrote. April 18th, the two sides settled right before the court case was beginning. Fox agreed to pay the voting machine company $787 million, and that hurt the stock price, which hurt investors who held Fox stock. And that's why Oregon leaders started to wonder, maybe we should take some action. I recently sat down with the state treasurer, Tobias Reed, to talk about it.
So in the case of Fox, it's been widely reported that Fox has settled a lawsuit with Dominion for nearly $800 million, and that there are some other lawsuits in play. And we'd like to know how that affects the company and whether the decisions that the board has been making are in the interests of its shareholders.
So fundamentally, you're saying, board, you allowed this thing to continue with Dominion being libeled. You lost a lawsuit, you hurt the stock price, you hurt our investment?
That's the question we're asking. And the first step in that process is what's known as a books and records request, so that we can understand the impact. So we're interested in that based on what's been widely reported, and that might lead to further steps.
Do you know how much we have invested in them?
Yes, it's about $11.7 million, and in the context of the large pension fund, that's a lot of money to me and to a lot of people in our own lives. But it represents 0.0127% of the pension fund. So it's important to know our style. The people who work for Treasury are not stock pickers. We're not trying to time the market. We invest little bits in lots of different things. We're fans of the index strategy, where we can keep our costs low. But that means that we are exposed to lots of different things. And so being the diligent folks that we are, we're paying attention to that, and we want to assert our rights and ask the question of whether a board has been acting in the interests of the company and its shareholders.
I was a little surprised to hear that the state is invested in Fox.
Yeah, it's consistent with that strategy, because we are not so arrogant as to think that we can pick individual stocks and be successful over the long run. Our style is to be widely exposed to lots of different things, not trying to time the market, not trying to be smarter than the crowds in that sense. So if you ask me if we're exposed to a given publicly traded company, the answer is almost certainly yes, to some degree.
And I can just hear critics from the right, for example, saying, oh, you just want to do this because you're part of a progressive state and you want to take a shot at a conservative media.
We're interested in making sure that our investments are being well managed, that the boards of companies are meeting their obligations, that they're looking out for their shareholders. We do this in a variety of places, and that's consistent with our obligation to the 400,000 beneficiaries on whose behalf we're investing.
So how bad was Oregon's investment hit? You decide. The state holds both Class A and Class B shares of Fox stock. Class A traded for $34 a share on April 18th when the settlement happened, and it did fall, but then eventually climbed back up to $33.84 on June 8th before going down just a little bit last Friday. The Class B stock followed a similar pattern on April 18th. It traded at $31.20 a share, then fell after the settlement, but climbed to $31.40 by last Friday. The state treasurer said whether or not Oregon goes forward with a lawsuit against Fox depends on what it finds after getting the records that they've demanded there. So what do you think about this? Do you think the Attorney General and the Treasurer are doing the right thing to look into this and consider legal action? Or do you feel that since the investment is such a small part of the state's portfolio that a potential for a lawsuit is really a good bit of political posturing by the state leaders? Send us an email, will you? The address is thestory@kgw.com, or you can call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. I look forward to hearing from you. Meanwhile, the icy relations between Democrats and Republicans in the Oregon Senate may be thawing a little bit, and a solution might be taking shape that could end the Republican walkout. Nothing is set yet. Republicans walked out of the Senate chamber beginning May 3rd. Without their presence, there's no quorum, and without a quorum, the Senate cannot do anything as a group. OPB first reported today that efforts over the weekend to find a compromise between the Republicans and Democrats are starting to bear fruit. They reported that a framework appears to be in place. If approved by members, Democrats would make major concessions on bills creating new abortion rights and protections and gun possession. OPB specifically reports that one part of the compromise being discussed is getting away from giving girls under the age of 15 the absolute right to get an abortion without their parents' permission or knowledge. Instead, OPB reports a doctor could decide that the parents do not need to be notified if they decide that it would endanger the girl. If that is part of the final compromise, it would directly contradict what the Senate president has been saying many times and told me 3 times during our interview 2.5 weeks ago. But you won't touch 2002, right?
No, we've been pretty clear about that actually since the beginning of session. And really, when you look at voters and what they're asking us to do, ever since the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, Oregon voters have said we need to protect access to reproductive health for women in this state.
Is there any scenario in there that you see a compromise within that bill?
No, the bill is set to go. So right now, we have a very robust committee system in the state of Oregon, probably more robust than any other state in the entire country. That bill had months of work leading up to the legislative session. It received a hearing in the House. It received a bipartisan hearing through the Ways and Means process. It has received a floor vote in the House where the Republicans, I do want to note, stayed and they had diligent debate and raised a lot of questions. And then they voted on it. And that's what people are asking the Republicans in the Senate to do, is to come back and vote on that bill.
But are you willing to drive the session off a cliff for that bill?
Well, I'm not driving anywhere off a cliff. I can tell you this, that Oregon voters are expecting us to be here session after session voting on legislation, and that's what we're committed to do.
All right, but just to be clear, no way, no how you're moving at all on 2002?
No, that bill is definitely set. That is definitely for our members. It's a bright line. Women need reproductive health services in Oregon. We are not going back on our commitment to codifying Roe.
And I know it sounded like I was asking that question over and over and over again, but actually that happened during our 30-minute interview. We talk about some other stuff and then I'd bring it back, so we just put it all together for you. Anyway, Oregon is already one of the few states in the nation with no legal restrictions on abortion. The right to an abortion was actually expanded in 2017 under the Reproductive Health Equity Act. And in 2018, voters rejected a ballot measure that would have restricted state money being used for abortions. Both sides, Democrats and Republicans, have stayed pretty quiet when we've been asking about this reported compromise today. They'll only tell us that negotiations are ongoing. So I guess that's a good sign. If it does roll out the way that OPB has reported, it would certainly highlight the potency of these legislative walkouts. But we're watching what's happening in Salem, and we'll bring you the latest as soon as we hear about it. The other big story making waves across our area today: a verdict in a landmark class action lawsuit against Pacific Power for the 2020 Labor Day fires. A Multnomah County jury found the power company was both negligent and reckless by not shutting off its power lines, leading to one of the worst natural disasters in Oregon state history. A group of 17 plaintiffs now will get more than $70 million altogether, but the trial's not over yet. This has tagged as a $1.6 billion lawsuit. After the verdict this morning, the court then moved on to the next phase of the trial, where the jury will decide on punitive damages. that could be more money intended to prevent things like this from happening again. That's where the financial penalties could really stack up, could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars for the utility. The company's defense attorney says the bar is higher for punitive damages, and the power company should not have to pay more because they're already improving wildfire mitigation practices.
And is imposing punitive damages necessary to deter such conduct in the future when Pacific Power continues to make good on a host of improvements, many of which were planned long before Labor Day 2020?
The trial lasted 7 weeks. The verdict could set precedent for power companies and their future liability for wildfires when they're given notice of dangerous windstorms. And we've already seen some change. Both Pacific Power and PGE shut off power lines last September during a hot, windy storm. Pacific Power sent out a statement this afternoon saying they do plan to appeal and they are confident that they'll win. Coming up next on the story, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, died in prison over the weekend. His deadly bombings over the course of 17 years captured the attention of a nation and was one of the most expensive manhunts in history. We're taking a trip into the KGW vault for the few occasions where the feds were actually searching for their man in Oregon, and why that created tense times in the timber industry across the Northwest. That's next when the story returns. If you unplugged from the news over the weekend, like I did, you may have missed that Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber, died in prison at the age of 81. He was a Harvard-educated mathematician who ran a 17-year bombing campaign. He was found unresponsive in his cell Saturday morning and pronounced dead. Several news organizations are reporting the cause of death was suicide. Kaczynski's deadly homemade bombs killed 3 people and injured nearly 24 more. They changed the way that we mail packages and how we board airplanes and virtually shut down air travel here on the West Coast in July of 1995. Before Kaczynski was arrested, the FBI's search for him led agents to Oregon at least 2 separate times. And that gives us an opportunity to head into the KGW vault. In July of 1995, the FBI was going through a list of subscribers to a University of Oregon academic journal called critical sociology because they thought the Unabomber had been using jargon from the book. It was quite radical when released in the 1960s and was considered very left-wing. You may remember in 1995, the Unabomber's manifesto was published in the Washington Post, raising all kinds of ethical questions. But that manifesto caught the eye of Kaczynski's brother, who recognized the musings and reported him to the FBI.
It wouldn't have been right to allow him to hurt anyone else. He had to be stopped in some way, and that was the only way I could think to stop him.
At the time, the daily Washington Post newspaper was not available in Portland, but newsstands and stores here were swamped with calls from people who wanted to read the killer's manifesto.
I've had everybody from professors to just people off the street. I had one guy in here screaming that we were infringing on his free speech rights for not carrying it. A whole broad range of people.
And how many calls have you gotten?
I'd say 400 to 500.
Wow, how about that? The other time the FBI was involved in Oregon was that same year. The feds warned a Portland law firm that it could be a Unabomber target. The firm represented a timber company in a spotted owl case. The name of the firm and the lead attorney in that case were number 2 on a hit list in an underground environmental publication from 1990. By the way, the number 1 and the number 3 names on that list did indeed become Unabomber targets. The man at the top of the list was named Gil Murray. He was a timber lobbyist and president of the California Forestry Association. He died in a mail bomb blast in April of '95. A year later, timber industry execs were holding their annual meeting in the Columbia River Gorge. They reflected on the year since Murray's murder and then got a frightening call from the FBI. Here's John Catton.
As the industry opened its annual meetings this week in the Columbia Gorge, they talked about Gil Murray and the year since his death.
It's pretty apparent that the emotions that are tied to the issues that we deal with and to our industry have not subsided.
Amazingly, just 3 hours after Jim Geisinger made those remarks, the FBI called here to Skamania Lodge to tell Geisinger his name was found in Ted Kaczynski's residence in Montana, that the Unabomber suspect may have considered targeting Geisinger and other timber industry executives here in the Northwest.
Oh, I think my first reaction was to be thankful that this the person that has allegedly committed these crimes is behind bars. I also couldn't help but think about Gil Murray and his family and what they must be going through now that this man's been apprehended.
Geisinger says the FBI told him to be cautious, but also assured him they are very confident Kaczynski is their man. They gave Geisinger no reason to believe he's in continuing danger.
It could have been any one of us that was on that list that received that package.
David Ford, another timber lobbyist based in Portland, has learned his name was also found in Kaczynski's cabin.
And of course, after Kaczynski's arrest in early April of 1996, the rush was on to the small town of Lincoln, Montana, to talk to people who may have known the man who lived in that small shack in the woods and evaded capture for 17 years. Here's former King 5 reporter Jim Foreman.
While some have described the loner as weird, folks in Lincoln, where Kaczynski was a part-time fill-in postal worker, say he was quiet, always rode a bike, but not really all that strange.
He's not in any way bizarre. He was well-liked by the people who took the time to get to know him.
In fact, some in Lincoln say there are lots of so-called hermits living alone in the mountains.
Most people here, you have no idea who they are, where they came from. They're either your friends or they're not. You either associate with them or you don't.
At the town cafe, locals take in the headlines, and while we now know federal agents were staking out the area for some time, they saw no sign of them.
No, I don't think anybody knew they were around.
Fascinating stuff, I think. In 1998, Ted Kaczynski took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole, where he did indeed spend the rest of his days. Still to come on the story, a proud sailor in the Navy discharged for simply being himself.
The Navy not only didn't go easy on him, they couldn't have gone much worse.
One mom's promise to her dying son finally fulfilled after years of work, how she hopes to help thousands of others when this story returns.
Coming up at 6:30, a big scare at the Grand Floral Parade. Now the man allegedly behind the wheel answers to charges in court. Plus, heavy rain triggers massive mudslides where crews are working to clear 6 feet of muck from a major highway. And Clark County declares war on mosquitoes, what they are doing to get an early jump on what could be a very buggy summer. It's all ahead at 6:30. Hope to see you then.
Now to a story about a local mom following through on a promise to her dying son who was kicked out of the Navy in 1990 for being gay. He was one of many service members stripped of their benefits and opportunities for simply being himself. Alma McCarty shows us the struggle to restore some of what was lost.
Willamette National Cemetery, the final resting place for thousands of veterans. The last of more than a dozen services held Friday, one to honor the life, memory, and military service of Martin Cerezo.
He was a beautiful baby and a good baby. Smart, very smart. But he'd get in trouble at school, and in retrospect, I look back and I wonder if he was struggling with his sexuality.
Not long after high school, Martin came out to his mother, Cheryl.
He just blurted it out and he said, "Mom, I'm gay." And my world kind of stopped in that moment. I didn't know what to do except hug him and cry with him and tell him I loved him.
Though it didn't happen right away, she fully embraced him as he was.
He hasn't changed. I just have learned something. That's all.
In 1989, Cheryl says her oldest son expressed an interest in joining the U.S. Navy, but she admits she was worried for him.
It was very scary to me. And I told him that, and he said, "Mom, it'll be fine. I'll be fine. Nothing will happen."
And for a while, he was fine, more than fine, in fact, exceeding expectations as a sailor.
He was recommended for retention. He was recommended for promotion.
Cheryl says there's no doubt in her mind that he loved it. Martin was assigned to the USS Constellation, an aircraft carrier, making a months-long trip from San Diego to Philadelphia. But dreams of a promising career would come crashing down.
Shortly after he had turned 20, he called me, and he was crying. And someone had outed him as gay.
Martin was ordered to name names to out other men on board. Then he and several others were given an other than honorable discharge.
He really felt it when they stripped his stripes off of his uniform, when they escorted him to the gate, when they took away his ID card. He felt other than honorable. The Navy not only didn't go easy on him, they couldn't have gone much worse.
Though Martin lived a full life, Cheryl says this moment followed him.
He was running from something or looking for something.
He couldn't get certain jobs, nor could he get military benefits. And the times he tried to start the paperwork to get his discharge upgraded, the painful trauma returned.
He was 20 years old and being kicked out of the Navy again.
Then came liver problems, then worsening liver cancer. In 2020, doctors gave Martin and his mother the prognosis. He had only months to live. Before he died, Cheryl promised him his discharge status would be upgraded, that he'd be buried with full military honors.
I held his hand and I told him, and he squeezed my hand. On January 2nd of 2021, he died with his brothers and me by his bed.
More than 2 years later, and after so many obstacles.
It hasn't been easy. I've cried a lot of tears.
Cheryl secured not only the honorable discharge for her son, but also the honor of being buried here at Willamette National Cemetery.
And I know that I have done what I promised him I would do as he lay dying. He was a good man, an honorable man.
That's Alma McCarty reporting. Cheryl says although she followed through on her promise to her son, her fight continues. She wants to help thousands of others who are discharged for being who they are get their full benefits and honors for their service in the United States military. Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching. And remember, the story, our collective story, that never ends. Be sure to stick around now for the news at 6:30, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow.